Ladies and gentlemen, when Nietzsche declared, "God is dead," he was not celebrating atheism nor mocking faith. He was holding a mirror to civilization. He was pointing to the collapse of certainty, the erosion of absolutes, the death of the external anchor that once gave life meaning. For centuries, people relied on God, not only as a deity, but as the foundation of morality, order, and purpose. When that God died in the modern age, humanity was left trembling in the void, staring into an abyss with no guide and no guarantee. This death did not free us as much as it burdened us, for when the old structures crumble, what remains? Responsibility. The responsibility to create our own meaning, to forge our own values, to carry the weight of existence without divine instructions. And many, Nietzsche observed, could not bear this weight. They turned instead to false gods, comfort, conformity, consumerism, shallow ideologies that promised security without demanding self-overcoming. Here lies the root of suffering, not the absence of God, but the paralysis that follows his death. People cling to old certainties or numb themselves with distractions, rather than facing the terrifying freedom that is now theirs. Nietzsche's words are a challenge. Will you crumble under the burden of meaninglessness, or will you rise to become the creator of new values? The death of God is not the end. It is an invitation. An invitation to become what Nietzsche called the Übermensch, the one who dares to shape life out of chaos, to affirm existence without needing divine permission, to say yes to life in all its pain and beauty. The question is not who will save you. The question is, will you save yourself? So if you are suffering, it is not because God is gone. It is because you have not yet discovered the courage to live as though you were your own source of meaning. The chains are broken. What you do with your freedom is now entirely in your hands. When Nietzsche proclaimed, "God is dead," he was not writing the obituary of a deity, but diagnosing the condition of culture. What he meant was not that some divine being had literally perished, but that the collective belief in God as the absolute foundation of morality, order, and truth had collapsed. For centuries, Western civilization rested on the certainty that life had meaning because it was given by God, that morality had authority because it was commanded by God, and that truth was grounded in divine order. In Nietzsche's time, however, science, philosophy, and cultural shifts had begun to dismantle these foundations. Darwin challenged the idea of divine creation. Historical criticism questioned the sacredness of Scripture, and modern philosophy eroded the certainty of metaphysical absolutes. The result was not merely an intellectual shift, but a spiritual earthquake. The phrase "God is dead" captures the realization that the old structures no longer held sway. The anchor had been cut, and humanity was now adrift in an open sea. Yet Nietzsche's insight was not triumphal. He did not shout these words in celebration, but in lament, even fear, for he saw clearly that most people were not prepared to live without God. The death of God meant the death of inherited meaning, and for Nietzsche, this opened the door to nihilism, the sense that life has no value, no purpose, no direction. What makes this symbolic death so powerful is that it is both liberation and crisis. On one hand, it freed humanity from dogmas that often constrained creativity and individual freedom. Without God dictating every moral code, humans could reimagine themselves and their world. On the other hand, it removed the safety net. Without an absolute to lean on, individuals were forced to confront existence directly, stripped of guarantees. This confrontation is terrifying. It demands maturity, responsibility, and the courage to create new values rather than simply inheriting them. Nietzsche's warning was that many would misunderstand the event. Some would cling to the corpse of God, pretending that nothing had changed, trying to maintain the old order through tradition and blind faith. Others would replace God with new idols, political ideologies, material wealth, shallow pleasures, anything to avoid facing the abyss of freedom. Both responses, Nietzsche argued, were evasions. They were ways of refusing to confront the deeper truth, that with the collapse of divine authority, humanity must now become its own source of meaning. The symbolic death of God thus points to the fragility of human certainty. It reminds us that our deepest beliefs can dissolve, leaving us unmoored. But Nietzsche also saw in this crisis a possibility, the birth of a stronger, freer human being. The recognition that God is dead is not meant to end in despair. It is meant to provoke a transformation. By accepting the loss of absolutes, we open ourselves to the task of creation. We are invited to become artists of our own existence, shaping values not because they are given from above, but because they emerge from the depths of life itself. In this sense, God is dead is less about destruction than about responsibility. It forces the question, without external authority, will you collapse into nihilism, or will you rise to the challenge of creating meaning in a godless world? Nietzsche's diagnosis was stark, but his challenge was hopeful. Humanity can live without God, but only if it dares to live courageously, authentically, and creatively. The loss of certainty, for Nietzsche, was not a minor shift in belief, but a rupture at the core of human existence. When he declared that God is dead, he understood the psychological and cultural consequences of such a collapse. For centuries, belief in God had given life an anchor. People could endure suffering because they believed it had a purpose. They could act morally because they believed those laws were eternal and divinely sanctioned. They could confront death because they trusted in an afterlife. When this structure disintegrated, what was left was not simply a neutral void, but a terrifying sense of meaninglessness. Nietzsche's insight was that this void would create immense suffering, because human beings are not naturally prepared to live without certainty. The human mind craves stability. It wants to believe that life has a reason, that justice ultimately prevails, and that there is some order to the chaos of existence. Without that assurance, people feel groundless, as though they are standing on quicksand. This is why Nietzsche described the death of God as the greatest event of modern times. With the old foundations gone, humanity found itself disoriented, unsure how to act, how to judge, how to hope. The suffering that arises from this uncertainty is not merely intellectual. It seeps into every aspect of life. People experience anxiety, despair, and alienation because the structures that once provided comfort no longer seem credible. Nietzsche recognized that many would attempt to cling to the old certainty even after its foundation had collapsed. They would continue to live as though God still provided order, pretending not to notice that belief had withered. This clinging, however, only deepens suffering because it is a denial of reality. To live in the shadow of a dead God is to inhabit a contradiction, outwardly repeating rituals, inwardly feeling the hollowness of their meaning. Such a life breeds quiet despair. Others, unable to endure uncertainty, would rush to replace God with new absolutes, ideology, science, nationalism, or material wealth. Yet these replacements are fragile, unable to bear the full weight of human longing for purpose. They too eventually disappoint, and the suffering returns with even greater force. Nietzsche saw this cycle as the essence of modern nihilism, the desperate search for meaning where none is given. The suffering of uncertainty is not just about the absence of answers, but about the overwhelming freedom it implies. If no divine authority dictates what is right or wrong, then the burden of choice falls entirely on the individual. Freedom sounds glorious, but in reality, it can feel unbearable. The responsibility to create one's own values, to live without a script, exposes people to constant doubt. Am I living correctly? Does this life matter? What if everything I build collapses into nothing? These questions are unavoidable once certainty is gone. And yet, Nietzsche did not believe that this suffering was meaningless. He saw it as the necessary crucible for transformation. To endure the loss of certainty is to confront existence in its raw form, without illusions. It is painful, yes, but it is also liberating. Only by facing this void can a person begin to create their own meaning, rather than passively inheriting one. The suffering, in this sense, is not an end but a passage, a trial that can lead to a deeper, more authentic way of living. The loss of certainty, then, is both the root of suffering and the doorway to growth. It strips away comfort but forces the individual to stand on their own, to live not by inherited dogma but by self-created values. Nietzsche believed that those who can endure this suffering without collapsing into despair or clinging to false certainties have the chance to become something greater, beings who affirm life not because it is guaranteed to be meaningful, but because they have the courage to give it meaning themselves. Nietzsche understood something profoundly unsettling about human beings. While we speak of freedom as the highest good, in practice we often fear it. The death of God, for Nietzsche, shattered the old moral framework that had guided humanity for centuries. Without divine law to dictate right and wrong, individuals were suddenly faced with an unprecedented level of freedom. At first glance, this might appear exhilarating. Yet Nietzsche saw that most people did not embrace this newfound autonomy. Instead, they recoiled from it. Why? Because freedom is not merely the absence of constraint. It is the burden of responsibility. To be free means to stand alone, to create one's own values, to shape one's own destiny without the reassurance of eternal rules. And for many, this is a terrifying prospect. Humans crave structure. The laws of God, the traditions of society, and the moral codes of culture provided people with a comforting script. These rules offered clarity, follow them, and life has order, purpose, and direction. When that script disappears, individuals are left to write their own. But to write one's own script requires courage, imagination, and a willingness to face uncertainty. Most people, Nietzsche argued, would rather surrender that freedom in exchange for security. This is why he believed that the death of God, instead of liberating humanity, often led to deeper suffering. People were free, but they could not bear the weight of their freedom. This fear of freedom expresses itself in many ways. Some retreat into conformity, choosing to blend into the crowd rather than forge an individual path. They adopt the values of the majority, not because those values resonate with their deepest self, but because it spares them from the anxiety of choice. Others turn to new systems of authority, political ideologies, rigid philosophies, or even consumerism, as substitutes for the old religious framework. In all cases, the goal is the same: to avoid the vertigo that true freedom brings. Nietzsche saw this avoidance as a form of spiritual cowardice. Instead of rising to the challenge of becoming creators of meaning, most people became dependent on external structures to tell them how to live. He described this state as the herd mentality, where individuals suppress their uniqueness to dissolve into the safety of the group. To be free, truly free, would require individuals to step out of the herd, to risk alienation, to stand face to face with the void and say, "I will give my life meaning, even if the universe offers none." The paradox of freedom is that it strips away excuses. With God gone, one can no longer say, "I act this way because it is commanded." One can no longer lean on destiny or divine will. Every decision, every act, every value becomes a reflection of the individual's choice. This is exhilarating for the strong, but unbearable for the weak. Freedom reveals not just possibility, but responsibility, and responsibility is heavy. Nietzsche's insight here remains as relevant as ever. Many today live in societies where religious structures no longer dominate, yet instead of embracing freedom, people numb themselves with distractions, technology, entertainment, consumption, anything to silence the inner demand to live deliberately. Freedom is available, but few dare to claim it fully. For Nietzsche, this fear of freedom was precisely why he spoke of the Übermensch, the one who would not shrink from the burden of choice, but embrace it, the one who would create new values in the face of chaos. Most people, he admitted, would never reach this point. They would prefer comfort over freedom, conformity over authenticity, illusions over truth. But for those few who dared, freedom was not a curse. It was the path to greatness. The truth is that humans fear freedom because it strips away certainty, security, and external validation. Yet for Nietzsche, this very fear is the challenge we must overcome. To embrace freedom is to step into your own power, to live without excuses, and to affirm life as your own creation. Only then can suffering transform into strength, and only then does freedom become real. When Nietzsche declared that God is dead, he was not only observing the decline of traditional religion, but also predicting what would inevitably follow. In the vacuum left by the death of God, humanity would create false gods. Nietzsche understood that people cannot live in pure emptiness. When the old foundation of meaning collapses, the instinct is not to embrace the void, but to replace it with something else, anything that can provide a sense of stability, identity, and purpose. Yet these replacements, Nietzsche argued, are often shallow, fragile, and even destructive. They are idols that give the illusion of meaning without the depth or durability of genuine values. False gods take many forms. For some, ideology becomes the substitute. Political systems, whether nationalism, communism, or fascism, promise salvation, order, and unity. People rally behind them with religious fervor, chanting slogans in place of prayers, worshiping the state or the leader as though divine. For others, consumerism fills the gap. The endless pursuit of wealth, possessions, and status becomes a kind of religion, offering fleeting satisfaction in exchange for lifelong servitude to desire. Still others turn to science or rationality itself as an absolute, not as a tool, but as a dogma, imagining that facts alone can replace the deeper human hunger for meaning. What unites these false gods is that they are external crutches. Instead of confronting the terrifying freedom of creating values for oneself, people surrender to ready-made systems that dictate what to believe, how to behave, and what to pursue. These systems mimic the certainty that God once provided, but without the transcendence. They may offer comfort, but they also enslave. For Nietzsche, this substitution is not progress but regression, because it keeps humanity dependent, afraid of standing on its own. The danger of false gods is not only that they are illusions, but that they intensify suffering. When people devote themselves to these substitutes, they often discover, sometimes too late, that the promises were hollow. Wealth does not provide lasting fulfillment. Political ideologies collapse under corruption and contradiction. Blind faith in progress cannot protect against despair. And when these false gods fail, the suffering returns, sharper than before, because people must face the truth that they built their lives on sand. Nietzsche foresaw this cycle and called it nihilism, the emptiness that comes when the old meaning is gone, but the new meaning is not yet created. False gods are humanity's attempt to escape nihilism without confronting it. But Nietzsche argued that this escape only delays the real task. The only way forward is not to cling to idols, but to embrace the abyss directly, to accept the death of old certainties, and then create new values rooted in life itself. This is why Nietzsche spoke of the Übermensch, not as a superhuman fantasy, but as an ideal for those who refuse false gods and instead forge their own path. The Übermensch does not worship ideology, wealth, or conformity. He affirms life as it is, with all its chaos, and creates meaning from his own strength and creativity. In the end, Nietzsche's warning about false gods is not just historical, it is timeless. Whenever humanity loses an old foundation, the temptation is always to invent another illusion to take its place. But Nietzsche insists that real growth begins only when we resist this temptation. False gods may soothe us for a time, but they cannot save us. They are masks worn over the abyss. To tear away those masks and face existence honestly is frightening, but it is also the first step toward freedom. Nietzsche believed that much of human suffering is not caused by the raw conditions of life itself, but by the way we avoid confronting them. When he declared God is dead, he knew the consequence was a world stripped of absolutes, a world without divine guarantees of meaning, morality, or justice. For many, this realization was unbearable, and instead of facing it, they sought escape. They clung to old beliefs that had already lost their foundation, or they created false idols, ideologies, consumerism, shallow pleasures, to mask the void. But Nietzsche argued that avoidance does not heal suffering, it intensifies it. It is not the void itself that destroys us, but our refusal to face it. Suffering arises from avoidance because what we resist does not disappear, it grows stronger. By denying the truth of God's death, or by distracting ourselves from the emptiness it reveals, we live in contradiction. Outwardly, we may act as though life still has fixed meaning, but inwardly we feel the hollowness. This inner conflict breeds despair, anxiety, and a deep sense of inauthenticity. Nietzsche observed that many people live in this way, repeating rituals, following social conventions, or chasing material success, all while carrying a silent awareness that these things do not truly satisfy. The suffering of avoidance is the suffering of dishonesty, of living out of alignment with reality. Nietzsche's critique of avoidance is psychological as well as philosophical. He understood that the human psyche is wounded when it splits itself, when it hides from truths it cannot bear. Avoidance leads to repression, repression leads to distortion, and distortion leads to neurosis. The very energy spent denying or numbing the void becomes a source of torment. People drink, consume, overwork, or drown themselves in noise, not to face the silence within. Yet in doing so, they strengthen the very emptiness they fear. Avoidance does not make the abyss go away, it only ensures that the abyss will haunt us in shadows. For Nietzsche, the task is not to avoid suffering, but to confront it directly. He believed that the void revealed by God's death is not only a threat, but also an opportunity. To look into the abyss without flinching is to strip away illusions and see life as it is, chaotic, uncertain, without guarantees. At first, this vision wounds us, but it also liberates us. In that moment of confrontation, we stop running from life and begin to create meaning from within ourselves. The pain of facing the void is sharp, but it is transformative. The pain of avoiding it, by contrast, is endless, because it postpones growth indefinitely. Nietzsche's idea is clear. Suffering is not a problem to be eliminated, but a teacher to be embraced. When we avoid suffering, we rob ourselves of its lessons. When we face it, we discover strength, resilience, and creativity we did not know we had. The great tragedy is not that God is dead, but that most people cannot bear to face the responsibility this truth demands. They suffer not because life is meaningless, but because they refuse to confront meaninglessness and forge new values of their own. In Nietzsche's vision, the highest form of courage is to stop avoiding, to step willingly into the void, to endure the suffering of uncertainty, and to emerge as the creator of meaning. Avoidance chains us to despair. Confrontation opens the path to freedom. Thus, suffering is not the enemy, avoidance is. To live fully, one must allow suffering to strip away illusions until what remains is the raw power to say yes to life as it is. Nietzsche often emphasized that the greatest struggle in life is not against external enemies, oppressive systems, or hostile environments, but against the self. When he declared, "God is dead," he was pointing to a reality where old frameworks of morality and divine authority no longer provided guidance. In that world, the challenge was no longer obedience to an external law, but the responsibility to create one's own. This responsibility is immense, and it is here that Nietzsche introduces the idea of self-overcoming. To live authentically after the death of God, one must confront, transform, and ultimately transcend the limitations of one's own being. Self-overcoming begins with honesty. Nietzsche urged people to look at themselves without illusions, their desires, fears, contradictions, and weaknesses. Most people, he argued, live in denial, masking their insecurities with borrowed beliefs, societal norms, or empty routines. They avoid the discomfort of self-examination because to see oneself clearly can be painful. Yet Nietzsche insisted that without this raw honesty, no growth is possible. The first act of self-overcoming is to admit to oneself, I am unfinished, I am flawed, and I am responsible for what I become. The next step is the transformation of weakness into strength. Nietzsche's famous idea of the will to power was not about domination over others, but about the capacity to turn life's struggles into fuel for growth. Every pain, every loss, every challenge is an opportunity to rise above oneself. To practice self-overcoming is to use suffering as a tool, not as an excuse. For example, resentment, envy, and despair are natural human responses to hardship. But if left unchecked, they corrode the spirit. Nietzsche urged us to transform these impulses into creativity, courage, and resilience. This is how one turns the raw material of life, however ugly, into something noble. Self-overcoming also requires breaking free from the herd. In Nietzsche's view, society often lures people into conformity, offering safety in exchange for individuality. Rules, traditions, and collective identities can be comforting, but they also prevent true self-mastery. The individual who seeks to overcome themselves must resist the temptation to dissolve into the crowd. They must accept solitude, risk, and sometimes even ridicule. It is in isolation, Nietzsche believed, that one confronts oneself most deeply and discovers the strength to create values rather than inherit them. Importantly, self-overcoming is never complete. It is not a single victory, but a lifelong process. Each time we transcend one limitation, new challenges appear. Nietzsche saw life as a continual cycle of death and rebirth within the self, where old versions of us must die for new ones to emerge. To cling to a fixed identity is to stagnate. To embrace constant transformation is to live fully. The self is not a finished product, but an evolving creation. Ultimately, Nietzsche's call to self-overcoming is a call to courage. It asks us to face the void without retreat, to endure suffering without despair, and to craft meaning where none is given. This is not a path for the faint of heart. It demands strength, creativity, and an unrelenting will to rise above one's own smallness. But for Nietzsche, it is the only path that leads to true freedom. To overcome oneself is to step into the possibility of becoming something greater, a creator of values, a lover of life, and perhaps an Übermensch.